Have you ever been the invisible child in your family, watching the golden child get away with everything, even when they actively try to destroy your life? Imagine coming home from an exhausting 18-hour shift, only to find your parents packing your bags and kicking you out, all because your perfect sister spun a malicious lie that you were a complete failure. For 5 years, my parents entirely erased me from their lives. They thought I was ruined. But they had absolutely no idea that 5 years later, the sister who destroyed my reputation would be wheeled into my hospital bleeding out, with her survival resting entirely in my hands. Before we get into the details of exactly how this showdown happened, let me know in the comments. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it there right now? I always love seeing where this community is tuning in from. The silence in our household was not merely an absence of sound. It was a calculated strategy. It was a deliberate void, carved out to elevate one child above the rest. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a room where the golden child demanded every ounce of oxygen, leaving the other child to suffocate in the remaining stale air. I learned early on that in our family, visibility was currency, and my name had depreciated to zero value. I was the shadow haunting the edges of their light. My sister, Alina, was the performer. She was the sun around which our family orbit revolved. By the time she was 10, she was winning spelling bees with the flair of a television host. My parents' eyes would physically shift toward her, their expressions softening into raptures of pride that made me feel like a ghost. When Alina stumbled, my father would rush to pick her up and scrub the dirt from her knees. When I stumbled, however, my father would correct my posture with a cold, critical tone, acting as if my fall was a personal moral failing. I remember the first time I truly understood my invisibility. Alina was 7 and she had carelessly torn our mother's favorite velvet curtain. She didn't cry. She stood tall, her chin jutting out like a defiant general, and told our father it was an accident caused by me pushing her. My father didn't even look at me. He looked at the ruined fabric, then at Alina's fake, tear-streaked face and said, "Why did you push her, Sarah?" The question was not an inquiry. It was an accusation. No one apologized. No one blamed Alina. The narrative was set instantly. I was the trouble and Alina was the victim. That dynamic hardened into concrete as we grew. Alina's successes were public events broadcast to the extended family with the intensity of a state visit. But Alina's performance required an audience, and she craved validation so fiercely that it became a weapon. If I didn't clap loud enough, she would turn that disappointment into a spear aimed directly at my parents. "Why don't you try so hard, Sarah?" she would ask, her voice dripping with feigned innocence. My parents, image-obsessed to the core, believed her polished smile was the truth, and my quietness was a failure. I was a background character in the story of their lives, destined to fade away so the golden child could shine forever. 5 years into my rigorous third-year surgical residency, the dynamic of invisibility finally snapped. It transformed from a passive burden into an active, malicious weapon wielded by Alina. It was a Tuesday, the kind of day that usually felt endless in the hospital corridors, filled with the low hum of monitors and the sterile smell of antiseptic. I had been working exhausting 18-hour shifts. A close colleague of mine, a brilliant medical student named David, had been struggling for weeks with a severe family emergency. He was drowning in grief, and he needed space to breathe. I took a brief, fully approved leave of absence from the hospital to help him coordinate care for his family. We were partners in the residency program, and I was the only one who truly saw the weight he was carrying. But while I was away, Alina decided to launch her ultimate campaign of destruction. She knew that if I vanished for even a moment, she could completely distort my reality. She went to my parents and told them I had dropped out of medical school entirely. Her story was intricate, woven with lies so plausible that she didn't even need to raise her voice. She claimed that I had cracked under the pressure of the curriculum, that I was no longer up to the task, and that I had run away to an underground rehabilitation center to deal with severe addiction. She didn't tell them about my 18-hour shifts. She didn't tell them about the residency. She simply told them I was a complete disaster. When I finally returned to the house 3 days later, having secured my temporary leave, I found a home that felt like a foreign country. The atmosphere was thick with hostility. My mother, Alina, stood in the foyer with a folder in her hand, her eyes cold as flint. "We can't let you come back," she said, her voice completely flat. "You've proven you aren't fit for this profession. You've been gone for a week and Alina told us everything. We heard you've been unstable." I tried to explain. "Mom, Dad, I'm not dropping out. I'm on a leave of absence. I have all my hospital records right here. I'm healthy." But she cut me off. "Don't lie to us," she snapped. "Alina saw you acting strange." You're lying. The physical evidence of my life as a doctor was dismantled right in front of me. One by one, they began to return my things. My textbooks, which I had used for 3 years, were placed in a cardboard box with a disdainful huff. My stethoscope, wrapped in its blue cloth, was tossed on top. Keep these, my father said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. Maybe next time you decide to become a janitor, you'll need them. The most cutting part was the total silence regarding the truth. When I showed them my emails, the logs of my hospital shifts, and the messages from my attending surgeon, they refused to even read them. They simply pushed the papers back across the table. They assumed my absence was confirmation of their worst fears. They blocked my number before I could even walk out the door. They erased 5 years of sacrifice, the countless nights spent studying, and the lives I had helped save, reducing them all to a single fabricated sentence. I walked out of that door carrying a heavy cardboard box, the weight of their rejection settling onto my shoulders like a lead coat. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just turned and walked away. The verdict was sealed not with a dramatic explosion but with a series of calculated final cuts. They didn't just block my number. They severed the digital lifeline entirely. When I tried to call my mother from the hospital parking lot, her voicemail picked up instantly. Every text I sent was met with a system error. I was the ghost who had been completely exorcised. They refused to open the letters I sent detailing the reality of my residency. I sent them copies of my grades, my certifications, and eventually my marriage license when I married my fiancé. They all returned to me unopened, sometimes with a single red stamp across the front. Refused. At the next Thanksgiving dinner, the narrative was fully rewritten. I wasn't a struggling student, I was a cautionary tale. Sarah ran away, my mother would tell the extended family, her voice dripping with pity. She couldn't handle the pressure. She's out there somewhere doing dangerous things. They celebrated my sister's graduation and her engagement, using those milestones as a mirror to show everyone how much I had failed. For 5 years, I existed in a limbo where I was alive but completely unacknowledged by my own blood. They had turned a lie into a crusade. But in that absolute silence, a strange thing began to happen. The silence stopped being a weapon against me and started becoming my sanctuary. If they wouldn't hear me, if they wouldn't see me, then I would have to become someone they couldn't ignore. I would have to become someone so undeniably brilliant that the silence of their rejection would no longer be enough to keep me in the dark. I spent years taking night shifts at the community hospital, working while my peers slept, while my parents celebrated holidays without me, and while my sister performed for the world. I studied until my eyes burned and my fingers cramped. When I finally returned to medical school, fully funded by a private scholarship, I graduated at the top of my class. I didn't need their name anymore. I had built my own. The years that followed were a blur of scrub caps, blood-stained gowns, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. I became a resident, then an attending, then a fellow, and finally the chief of trauma surgery at St. Jude's Regional Hospital. It was a title that demanded precision, courage, and an unyielding commitment to saving lives. I wore the white coat as a badge of my own survival. Every stitch I placed was a testament to the fact that I existed. Then came the day. It was a Tuesday, just like the day my life had shattered 5 years prior. The pager went off at 3 in the morning, a sharp mechanical chirp that cut through the sterile hum of the hospital. Trauma Bay 4, blunt abdominal trauma. Hemodynamically unstable. Grade 3 liver laceration. Multiple rib fractures. The words were clinical and highly urgent. As I ran down the corridor, I didn't think of my parents or the lies they had told. I thought only of the patient. In that moment, I was not Sarah, the invisible daughter. I was Dr. Oulette, the savior. The trauma bay was a war zone. The smell of antiseptic and raw blood hung heavy in the air, mixing with the frantic beep of monitors and the shouted orders of the trauma team. Then, the gurney rolled in. The patient was a young woman, barely conscious, her skin pale as parchment. A severe car crash had completely shattered her body. Alina, I whispered, the name catching in my throat before I could suppress it. It wasn't the Alina I remembered from the past. This was a broken, bleeding stranger. Her chest rose and fell in a shallow, ragged rhythm. The surgical team moved into formation. I grabbed the scalpel, my hand moving with an instinctual grace honed in 1,000 previous surgeries. Incision, I commanded. As I sliced through the tissue, the world narrowed down to a tiny circle of flesh and bone. I saw the liver damage and I knew the odds were terribly against her, but I didn't have time to mourn statistics. I had only time to fight. For the next 6 hours, the world didn't exist. There were no parents, no sisters, no lies, no disownments. There was only the incision, the suture, the clamp, and the life I was pulling out of the precipice. Every time a monitor beeped with a critical drop in pressure, I countered with a precise maneuver. I was rewriting her story, stitching her back together just as I had stitched myself back together after their silence. And then the rhythm changed. The blood pressure stabilized. The heart rate slowed to a steady, rhythmic thud. "She's stable," I announced, my voice echoing in the bay. The team exhaled in collective relief. I wiped a smudge of blood from my cheek, looking at the girl on the bed. She was my sister. She was the lie that had cost me 5 years of my life. The waiting room of St. Jude's Trauma Center was a stark contrast to the sterile silence of the operating room. I stood in the hallway, adjusting my surgical mask. Through the glass, I could see my family. My father sat with his hands clasped tightly over his knees. My mother had her head bowed, praying under her breath. When I finally pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the medical team poured out behind me. My parents didn't see a doctor in scrubs. They expected a stranger, a colleague, anyone to give them the news. But as the hospital light caught the silver badge pinned to my chest, the atmosphere violently shifted. It wasn't the badge itself that stopped them. It was the name engraved on it. Dr. Esoulet, Chief of Trauma Surgery. The realization hit my father like a physical blow. His head snapped up, his eyes widening in a mixture of pure terror and total confusion. He stared at the name, then at the face of the woman who was holding the scalpel that had just saved his daughter's life. Elena. My mother's voice cracked. She looked up and her gaze landed entirely on me. Time seemed to dilate. 5 years of lies and exclusion compressed into a single suffocating second. She saw the exhaustion in my eyes, the precision in my stance, and the absolute authority in my posture. My father stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Sarah," he whispered, the name sounding foreign on his tongue, a ghost word he thought he had successfully buried. I wasn't screaming. I stood there calm as the deep sea, letting the absolute facts wash over them. "You wanted to know where I went," I said, my voice steady and devoid of all emotion. I took a step forward, the white coat swishing around my legs. "Now you see it, I am the one who just saved your daughter." My mother reached out, her hands trembling violently. "She's alive," she choked out, tears streaming down her face. "She's alive, Sarah, we didn't know." But before they could offer any pathetic excuses, the script completely flipped. Aunt Ruth arrived. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked straight into the ICU waiting area, her expression grim. She was carrying a thick, leather-bound folder that clinked softly as she set it down. Aunt Ruth ignored my father's confused greeting. She walked straight to the glass partition, looked at me, then turned to my parents. "You want to know the truth?" she asked, her voice projecting clearly across the sterile room. "You want to know why Sarah left?" She opened the folder and slid a massive stack of papers across the desk, stopping inches from my father's trembling hands. Those papers were not medical records. They were receipts. 5 years of receipts. Each one meticulously dated, each one linking directly back to Elena herself. There was the receipt for the fake prescription pad Elena had used to concoct the story of my addiction. There was the email log, showing the timestamps of the calls she made to my parents, lying about my behavior while I was actually at the hospital helping a colleague. There were photos Elena had staged to look like me slumped on a park bench. "This isn't a story," Aunt Ruth said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm tone. "This is a pattern. Every lie, every moment you pushed Sarah away, you did it because you were afraid she would outshine Elena. You didn't disown a daughter. You destroyed a person to keep the spotlight on yourselves. And now the spotlight is on the surgeon who just saved your child, not the victim who was never real." My father stared at the papers, the color completely draining from his skin as the weight of the undeniable evidence settled over him. The silence in the room was no longer passive. It was heavy with the reality of the proof. Elena's narrative had finally been dismantled piece by piece by the cold, hard facts Aunt Ruth had collected over 5 years. I stepped forward, leaving zero room for argument. "Elena will stay in the ICU," I stated, my voice carrying the weight of a final diagnosis. "But the conversation is over. There are no more lies. If you try to manipulate Elena's care, or if you try to spread another lie to the extended family, I will expose every single receipt in this folder to the entire world. I will destroy your reputation publicly, just as you tried to destroy mine in private." The threat hung in the air, sharp and cold. It was a boundary drawn in steel. I turned my back on them and walked to the nurse's station, leaving my parents to sit in the silence of their own making. 6 months is a long time to spend in the shadows. The road to reconciliation was not a paved highway of fairy tales. It was a winding, treacherous trail. I did not invite my parents into my home immediately. Instead, I offered them a test, a single, low-stakes opportunity to prove that they could respect my terms. I told them they could come to my house for exactly 1 hour. They were not allowed to make excuses. They were only allowed to listen. When they finally arrived on a quiet Sunday morning, they did not bring gifts. They brought nothing but themselves and the heavy weight of their guilt. We sat in my living room, the space between us filled with unspoken tension. They tried to apologize, but their words came out as stilted recitations. "We should have believed you," my mother cried. "We were so blind. I had to stop them." "I'm not interested in the story of what should have happened, Mom," I said firmly. "I'm interested in what is. Tell me what you feel right now, not what you think I want to hear." And so the real work began. It was a messy, clumsy attempt at honesty. They admitted for the very first time that they had chosen safety over truth, image over reality. There were no grand declarations of forgiveness from me, just the quiet, painful truth that they had deeply hurt me and they had finally stopped lying to themselves about it. When the hour was up, my father stood to leave, looking older and more tired than when he arrived. There was no tearful hug. Just a nod, a recognition of the massive distance that still existed between us and the very beginning of a new, slower path. As they drove away, I watched their taillights disappear, and for the first time in 5 years, I didn't feel the urge to chase them down or make them understand my worth. I simply turned off the light and closed the door. The invisible daughter was finally gone. In her place stood Sarah, a woman who had taken her parents' power to define her and turned it into her own unbreakable strength. The karma was done, the proof was seen. Now it was just life, ordinary, imperfect, and finally enough. I would love to hear your thoughts on this story. Did Sarah do the right thing by testing her parents with that strict 1 hour visit, or would you have kept the door permanently closed? Let me know your honest opinion in the comments below.